The next skill is the basic sprawl. This is one of the more fundamental defensive maneuvers, which we'll be going over more in a future DVD on defensive takedowns. But for now, this is a fundamental skill that's important, I think, at the beginning of this series. What's important in the sprawl is simply to be able to get your hips down, your arm in front of your opponent to prevent his attacking, or to at least slow down his attacking, and to be able to get your legs back. And those are three important components of a good sprawl. Of course, a sprawl is actually a technique or movement that, when done, is really more one of your latter lines of defense. It's more important to be able to control the situation with good tie-ups, being able to be attacking your opponent so that you're not having to worry so much about sprawling. And if an opponent does attack, it's good to be able to, for example, simply block him with your hand before you actually have to sprawl and go down to the mat. But presuming our opponent has blasted through our defenses, there are times when we're going to have to get our hips down and our feet back as quickly as possible. What's the basic technique and movement involved? First, I'm in my stance. As I had said earlier, it's important that we keep our elbows in, our hands close together so that our palms are not down and our elbows aren't out. I want to keep at least one hand fairly low at all times. I'm never reaching up with two hands. If I reach up to tie up with my opponent with one hand is always low. That's very, very important, because when I sprawl, I want at least one hand to be coming down quickly. That's part of my sprawling maneuver. Now, what's key is hip position and arm position. I've got to lower my level, almost like I'm about to attack. And as I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw my hips down and my legs back. So I'm going to come down, I want an arm in front of me, and I want my hips down. You'll notice when I sprawl, I want to stay off my knees. If my weight's on my knees, it's not on my opponent. So when I sprawl, the points of contact on the mat are going to be my 2 feet. My hips are going to be bowed. I'm not going to be arched in this direction like a cat back. My hips are going to be bowed into my opponent, or arched in this manner, so that my weight is on top of my opponent. Okay, of course I'm not going to be on my arms. Okay, my weight will hopefully be over his head and shoulders here. It's important as I do this to keep my head up, and it's important for me to go down right away. So when I sprawl, I'm going to be moving around. Again, I take small steps. I perceive my partner's attack or my opponent's attack, and I'm going to come down. And you'll notice here, I'm pushing my hips in. I'm off of my knees. My feet aren't right close together, but they're not so far apart that I'm unstable. They're behind me fairly wide, but comfortably wide. Okay, my head is up, and my hips are down on my opponent, pushing down on his head, which we'll get into tremendous detail on the Takedown Defense DVD. So I'm moving around, my partner attacks, down. Now, when you practice this, it's good to practice simply by, when we're doing our shadow wrestling, sprawling and then coming up, and you come up the opposite way. I move around, my opponent attacks, down, up. Notice my hands are down, and I get back in my wrestling position. Down, up, back in a wrestling position. Down, up, back in a wrestling position. You can combine this drill with the double drill. And if you have your instructor, for example, give you 60 seconds of this type of a drill for endurance and for developing technique, you're first moving around. They may say double, you do your double. May say double again, you do your double again. Instructor may say sprawl. Instructor may say sprawl again. May say double, sprawl, and so on. And you can actually combine your drop step with the sprawl by yourself, both to help with practicing the technique as well as an endurance exercise. Some important points about the sprawl. First, don't float when you sprawl. A mistake a lot of people make when they're learning to wrestle, and even some experienced wrestlers, they have a tendency to throw their weight up before they go down. And let me show you what they do. And you've probably seen this in certain wrestling rooms when people are practicing the the exercise to sprawl, the shadow wrestling sprawl drill. I don't want to do this. You notice how my hips first went up. I jumped up and a little bit back perhaps. But notice again, if I'm moving around here and I jump up to sprawl, that's a mistake. Why is that a mistake? If I'm attacking and my opponent is moving up, that gives me a little bit more time to get in to attack before his weight's able to get down. My goal is to get my weight down as fast as possible. And just like I don't back up before I shoot my double leg or do my drop step, and just like I don't pull my arms back before I attack, when I sprawl, I don't want to have my weight go up before it goes down. I want to just have it go down. And that's very, very important, because when you're learning this, there is a tendency to kind of jump your legs up and back. And what that does is that actually raises your hip. And your goal is to get your hips down quickly so that your opponent can't be driving through and attacking your legs. So as I'm moving around, you'll notice, boom, I want to go straight down to that sprawl, as opposed to popping my hips up first. That's a very dangerous mistake. And as you can see, if my opponent's going up as I'm attacking in, I may be in very favorable position, even if they kind of land on top of me. Let me demonstrate this principle for a moment. If Colby has a tendency to spring up before he comes down, that may give me enough time to get in favorable position, even though he ends up coming down on top of me, because his hips aren't low enough. Once more. So the principle here when you sprawl is that your hips need to go down from where they are, which is hopefully fairly low when you're in the wrestling stance, go down pretty straight, as opposed to coming up first because you're trying to get your legs back. Don't lift up to pull your legs back. Another important point. Learn to sprawl slightly to the right or to the left. For example, if my opponent is coming at me in this direction, so from your angle that you're watching this DVD coming straight at me, I typically don't want to just sprawl down and straight back. I would prefer to go slightly to the side. Now this varies. The side I want to transition to, either left or right from my perspective, the side I want to transition to is dependent upon the type of attack that my opponent is making. For example, if my opponent was attacking a single leg on this side, on my left leg, I would probably, when I sprawl, want to sprawl slightly away from that. Why? Because it will get me out more in front of my opponent, which will be crucial when we talk about defense in a future DVD. I don't want to go over too much in detail about that now, but I do want you to get the notion of learning to sprawl, and we'll talk about how to apply that later on. But I want you to get the notion of how to sprawl slightly to the side. So we're moving back and forth. My partner attacks, and I might go slightly to the side. He attacks in a different way, I might go to the other side. And again, I'm not going to go over the application of that now, but as you practice your sprawl, be aware that you don't simply all the time want to come straight back and down. You might want to shift slightly, and it's a subtle movement. I'm not going to try to really swing far. That's not what I'm trying to do, but I want you to just think, when you practice doing it a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, that'll make sense later on. But that's how I think is a more effective way to practice it, to prepare you for effective defensive maneuvers when your opponent actually has attacked you. Next, similarly, as when you sprawl slightly to the left and slightly to the right, you don't actually want your hips to be perfectly square many times when you sprawl. We'll talk about this again more when we come down to the formal aspects of defending takedowns. But my hips facing the viewer squarely right now aren't typically going to go straight flush to the mat. Even when I turn to the side, I don't want my hips exactly straight flush to the mat. Typically, when I sprawl, I'm going to be slightly to one side or the other, just slightly. We're not going to be making big, gross movements. But I want you to think about sprawling to be able to turn your hips slightly. So, for example, if my opponent or my partner were attacking my left leg as in a single leg position, when I sprawl, not only would I come slightly to the side here, but I would turn my hip slightly. I would turn my right hip slightly down. Why? Because if he is around my left leg and I come out in front of him, that's going to put more pressure on him. Again, I don't want to get into too much detail about that now, but I want to put that in your brain so that you can just practice that basic and fundamental movement and we'll apply it later on. But those are two subtleties I think that are really critical. Being able to come slightly to the left, slightly to the right, and to be able to learn how to tilt your hips just slightly to the left and slightly to the right when you sprawl. Another important point, and I mentioned this briefly a moment ago, is it's important that your weight is on your opponent and not on your knees. If Colby attacks me on a single leg takedown, as an example, it's important when I sprawl that my weight is on him, not straight down. I'm going to meet him with my hips. As he's coming in, my hips are coming down. I'm going to change his trajectory downward. So, Colby, he's going to lower his level. He's going to attack into me. His goal is going to be to try to knock me down, either with a single leg, double leg, etc. When I sprawl, again, he lowers his level. His angle of attack is straight into me. My hips aren't just going to go down. They're going to meet him as he comes in to try to change his trajectory down. And when we talked about the drop step before, we talked about how critical it was when we attack successfully to keep that motion lateral or even slightly up. So if I'm able to deflect his attack with my sprawl down, I'm going to get him in less favorable position. The impact is going to be on the mat in terms of his energy into me. My energy is going to be down on top of him with the sprawl. Let me demonstrate that. Notice, as I sprawl out here, I came slightly to the side, and I'm going to put my hands on the mat here, just so I'm not squishing Colby as I discuss this. But you'll notice I came out to the side. I tried blocking with my front hand as he came in, which bought me a little time. You'll notice, too, my hip, my right hip, is slightly more than flush. This would be flush, slightly more than flush. And you'll notice, too, I'm not exactly out in front. I'm slightly out past front. That is, if he was attacking on this side, he was hoping for a favorable angle on the single. And we'll go again over more of this type of tactics and strategy in our defensive DVDs. But you'll notice he wanted to get, if he has a single, wants to get an angle on me. Of course, I want to get more out in front. And if I can even get past front, that's going to help me. Okay? Just want to plant those seeds in your mind at this juncture. We'll be going on to a lot more later on as far as how I actually make that pay off for you defensively. Remember, however, your sprawl really is one of your last lines of defense, at least while you're actually on your feet. And while the sprawl is very, very important, it's more important to ultimately be able to work some tie-ups that we're going to go over shortly and be able to manipulate your opponent, for example, with pummeling position over and under, with proper ties, underhooks, 2-on-1s, etc. That will go a long way in terms of preventing your opponent from even initiating an attack. So do remember that the sprawl actually is one of your later lines of defense, and that you don't want to depend upon the sprawl to be the entirety of your defense. That's just one line of defense, and it is, frankly, more towards the end. I'd rather not be fighting my opponent at that point. I'd rather have controlled him initially with a good tie-up and with my own good attacks.